Great. Good afternoon, everyone. It is Thursday, April 8th at 2 p.m. This is Senate Education. We apologize for the late start. We had a scheduling misunderstanding on our end. We are very pleased to have Secretary French with us, our Secretary of Education, who is joining us today for his confirmation hearing with Senate Education. Process that it's an honor for the Senate to go through this process with the governor's appointees, and a particular honor for this committee to be working with Secretary French. So Secretary French, thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate your time today, as always. And I thought we might just open it up, as we had discussed a little bit yesterday, with you talking a little bit about some of your accomplishments that you were particularly pleased with over your tenure, as well as give us a sense of your vision going forward. That would be a great spot to start. And then I'm sure colleagues will have questions. So with that, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and speak with you. And I think for me, as an educator, I always appreciate the opportunity to reflect on where we've been and where we're going. And I honestly can say it's been challenging to carve out that moments of reflection in the context of the COVID emergency. So I appreciate it, and I don't think we've really had the opportunity to really take full stock of what's happened because we're still very much involved in sort of planning for the remaining phase of our emergency response. But I will say, to your prompt about proudest accomplishments, and I'll certainly, I could speak more to the COVID response, but I'm going to try not to, and just sort of comment on some of the accomplishments that were occurring pre-COVID, because I imagine we'll end up talking a bit about COVID anyway.
Mr. Secretary, I'm just going to interrupt for
sure.
Jeannie, would you just keep our other witness? Jeannie, why don't we not let anybody else in at the moment, just so we don't have any more interruptions? Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Secretary.
So if that's okay, I'd just talk about accomplishments relative to pre-COVID. I was appointed secretary in 2018. And at the moment, the biggest issue at hand was Act 46, and arguably one of the most complex education policies, I can say probably for 100 years. The last time the state had taken up the issue of school district consolidation was in the late 1880s. And I think, all said and done, whether you think Act 46 was a good idea or not, the agency's work in Act 46 was really exceedingly well done. We supported the state board through that very difficult work, and they certainly did an exceptionally good job as a board responding to those challenges. The agency also working directly with the Attorney General's office to defend the state through multiple appeals and ultimately a Supreme Court decision that essentially affirmed the agency's work throughout that process. And when I reflected on those court decisions one after the other, and ultimately the Supreme Court's decision, my response to my staff was that the work was "quote unquote" flawless, because I really found no error, and it was a very complex policy, very complex set of public deliberations, and I think everything else that was going on. It was a tremendous testimony to the dedication of agency staff, who, as you know, at the end of Act 46, no one was praising us for doing that work and helping the state fulfill that objective. But I think it was exceedingly well done. And I think in the context of just internally to the organization of the agency, I think as my background, I'm interested in organizational performance and organizational improvement. I knew coming into this job in 2018 that the agency as an organization needed to become more responsive and I'll say nimble. And I'm very pleased with how that sort of has evolved. We started with going through a bit of a restructuring process, and a key element of that was creating our first data division. The agency's it's about 160 employees organized by divisions that contain 20 to 30 people. And previously, the data functions were dispersed or embedded in the various other divisions. And the data piece is an essential function of the agency. It really touches on all aspects of our policy and our administration of policy. So the agency had been contemplating this concept of sort of bringing those people together and forming a single division. And when I arrived as secretary, and we had several major data projects also um, on sort of the front burner relative to what we call the state longitudinal data system, and then the report card. These were major systems, and the agency, frankly, over the years, never really had much success in operating state level data systems with school districts. So not only did we have these major systems, but we also had, which I should mention, also were significantly behind schedule. We also didn't really have a central organizational structure to supervise that process. So it was a conversation that Secretary Holcomb had started prior to my arrival, but when I came on board, more or less that change in leadership was a catalyst to create a division within the agency dedicated solely to data, and that's played out very well. Another key element of that was we worked on our a mission statement, if you will, what we call our purpose statement. And I qualified as a purpose statement because our mission and vision essentially flows from the law. And so we worked sort of top to bottom inside the agency to get some clarity among the employees as to what our purpose is. And our purpose basically is to fulfill the law and implement the law. And that's the basis for ensuring equal opportunity for all students to have access to a high quality education. But to work through that process is very useful because it assists us as part of a large bureaucratic organization to get coherence and clarity about what our work is and what our work is not. And it's always, I think, a temptation, a large organization like ours, to get into mission creep and so forth. But to just really reaffirm that our role is to, in our foundation of our authority, really flows from the law. And that was exceedingly useful, which was not only in forming divisions like the data division, because data, again, is an essential element of that purpose, but also then we went through we moved the agency in the middle. All this is going on simultaneously. So we have Major Data Systems Act 46, new secretary working on a purpose statement, but then we moved the agency from its previous location in Barrie to National Life. And we're able to sort of use all these sort of pieces, the opportunity to get clarity on our purpose, to stand up a new division. And we were able to design the use of our space in National Life to support that organizational structure. So the divisions and teams that sort of more naturally collaborate with each other were situated physically that way on the floor in National Life in proximity to each other. And at the same time, we also started to leverage some of the technology that we take for granted today inside the pandemic, but we started to use some of those tools internally as well pretty early as part of that reorg. Um, and then sort of lastly, on the sort of the internal piece, we're able to make a lot of progress on fulfilling a lot of our vacancies. When I arrived at secretary, there were about 25 vacancies, and I had heard a lot about agency capacity over the years. So I was a little mystified as to why we had 25 vacancies and there wasn't much recruitment going on. And we had to sort of unpack that. We had several key vacancies in leadership positions that probably would have been in charge of the recruitment processes. But we had a very decentralized recruitment process, and we were able to make a lot of progress on filling those positions, starting with filling many of the leadership positions that were vacant. And I'd say now we're essentially fully staffed. We have sort of the routine turnover. I think we're down to maybe under 10 vacancies, more like 8 or somewhere in that ballpark. So that was all good news. So, a lot of that combination of responding to the very large, complex policy issues while simultaneously doing some of that internal reorganization was a really, if it hadn't been for COVID, I would say that was a tremendous accomplishment in terms of the agency's growth and development. But it's certainly our response to COVID has been a significant aspect of our success. And when the initial part of the emergency, the thing someone would typically ask you, like, what keeps you up at night? And the things that I worried most about it was the things about luckily we had done the sort of reorganization and the purpose work prior to the emergency. I would hate to have had to try to do all that simultaneously. Responding to an emergency without having that organizational clarity would have been really challenging for the agency. So if I want to speak to the future a bit, I think, there's quite simply, it's coming out from the other end of the pandemic, and there's a balance, I think, that needs to be struck between, on the one hand, restoring the routines and the educational processes that our students are used to and our staff are used to. So that sort of return to normal, that needs to be balanced to a certain extent, I think, with potential opportunities. And I think this is the real challenge for leaders in these moments, is to realize, what from the past absolutely has to be preserved. What aspects of our education system are just transcendent, that always have to be present. Our commitment to equity, for example. But on the other hand, what processes should it be abandoned in favor of better meeting that goal of equity? And I think, particularly on modernization and education has been slow in its adoption of technology. And I think I observed yesterday, that the pandemic certainly accelerated our adoption of technology, and a lot of that was imperfect, but it still accelerated adoption. And the thing that I think everyone's struggling with now internationally in education is, like, how to make education more personal for the individual, how to make it be driven by the individual learner's needs as opposed to the system's needs. And that's a tremendous opportunity, I think, and particularly for Vermont, since we're such a small state. We need every Vermonter to have access to a high quality education. We need every Vermonter to be able to participate in society and have their own personal fulfillment. And that means, we're going to have to look closely at our organizational structure and the delivery model of education. We have many elements that are still held over from another century. Its organizational structure is still dependent on sort of technology and communication assumptions from a different century, and the idea that curriculum only can be found inside a schoolhouse, as opposed to the internet. So there's some assumptions that need to be better incorporated. I think, the pandemic has highlighted those to a certain extent. But I think, just looking back in the last couple months at how focused, inappropriately, I would say, we've been focused in our pandemic response about getting the system back to where it was. I mean, our whole concept of recovery in education is based on this assumption of getting back in recovering, getting back to where things were, to repairing the damage. The challenge, I think, for us as policy leaders is also going to be carving out some space to focus on the opportunities. And there's going to be new challenges, but I think there's also new opportunities. And I think, the underlying issues, the demographic challenges that Vermont had prior to the emergency are still with us. In my career as a superintendent, that conversation was largely focused on declining enrollments and how to manage that. I think we're going to find that issue still very much a real one. But now with the focus on the ability to work from home, perhaps there's new opportunities for Vermont to really lead in that regard, in providing flexible work opportunities for parents, and perhaps attract more remote learners to the state, more remote parents. But I think also equally important, and not just student demographics, we also have to consider the staff demographics. And this is increasingly becoming a front burner issue for me. I think we're going to be facing a significant labor shortage, perhaps quality issues in the educator pipeline development. And I think we're going to, as a rural state, going to need some aggressive policies in this area to ensure that we have qualified staff to meet our aspirations of offering a high quality education to all students, or education to all students. So why don't I end there and be happy to go where you'd like to go in terms of the conversation.
Committee, any questions right now? I'll start. I'm sorry, Senator Hooker, please.
Thank you. Secretary French, you mentioned, kind of education always kind of lagging behind in technology. And it seems to me that, it just comes down to money, usually. And it seems to me that society as a whole sees the need for education, but education is always kind of the whipping post when it comes to money for communities and what they're spending. So how do we change that culture or that impression, and what can we do as what can the agency do? Certainly, what can we do for teachers and staff to change that sort of blame that education is frequently gets when it costs a society money.
Yeah, you raised a couple of key points. I think I'll start on the last piece of it, like essentially how do we raise the prestige of education? And I think there were moments, particularly early in the pandemic response, where I think there was broad acknowledgement of how critical education was. I think all educators sort of stood up and noticed, oh, we're being appreciated. Now quite broadly. When the whole school system was shut down, people realized that education was a lot more than daycare. It was a lot more than academics. And particularly in Vermont, where our schools are, I call them community schools. They're deeply embedded in the routines of our communities. When we shut down our schools, we shut down many of the routines of our society. And so I think, the first challenge we have is to attend to the quality of our education workforce. And as I mentioned, I think that's going to be a concern, probably more so than before. But there's an element related to that is related to promotion of the profession. So we need to promote it as a career, and that gets into the recruitment strategies that are going to be necessary to sustain equality going forward. I think we need to attract a lot of people to the profession. There's a lot to be attracted to. One of the favorite questions I would ask teacher candidates when I was a principal is, sort of a trick question. To what extent do you see teaching as a calling or a profession? And one of the great privileges of being an educator is you can tap into that calling aspect, and not many professions have that. That our work is much more than a profession. It's really to change lives, and that's a tremendous attractor. We see, particularly in the age of technology, people seeking meaning in their lives, and education offers a great way to act that out and to really influence the future. So there's a lot we can do to sell that and sell the profession, and also, again, as a recruitment strategy, we have to attend to quality, and certainly that's part of the regulatory construct, ensuring people are well qualified. I think we also have to be really cognizant of making the position and making the work. And I'm not thinking just teachers, I'm just thinking of the leaders. We still have, I would say, 20% turnover in principals on an annual basis in Vermont. We have to make the work more doable. And we've been through a pretty traumatic experience with the No Child Left Behind Act in terms of pretty significant intrusion. I'll qualify it as intrusion of the federal government into education. And I got into leadership development when I was working at St. Michael's College. That was what my job was, to run a program for leadership and principal development. And I often ask the question, to what extent did No Child Left Behind Act function as a recruitment tool? I mean, if you picked up No Child Left Behind Act and its focus on adequate yearly progress, would you be attracted to doing that work at schools? I mean, that's sort of antithetical to this calling purpose. So I think, we've been through a lot in the last 20 years in education that has really made the work much more challenging than it was before. It's certainly much more complex, but we need to make the work more doable. When I started as secretary, that sort of observation was manifest when I'd go out to districts and they would say the phrase initiative fatigue. From a teacher's perspective, you just see these things coming at you. And we'd spend a lot of time trying to reassure them, no, this is not new. It's the same thing you were always doing, except it has 4 new names and new acronyms and so forth. But it really was new. And to struggle with that coherence in education, I think, is a key part of making the work more doable. To tap into the purpose, the moral purpose of schooling, the calling piece. I think there's a lot that could attract people to the profession, but we need to attend to those things. And it's sometimes you'll hear people talk about money and compensation. That's a critical piece. We have significant compensation inequalities across the state. In a course I used to teach on education finance, I'd have my students ultimately compare salary schedules across the state. And I had students coming from all parts of the state. And it's this pretty glaring when you look at, a salary schedule from the Northeast Kingdom that has 34 steps on it versus a Chittenden County schedule that has 12 steps, and the salary differential is $20,000. So that's a problem. And we're going to need to, particularly if we're committed to equal opportunity, we're going to have to figure out a way to adjust the compensation, I think, to make it competitive on a regional basis. So compensation is an element, but I think it's more about making the profession more doable. And through that sort of process, we also can make it more attractive to people and promote it better.
Senator Perchlik.
Yeah, thank you. I have a few questions, but the first one is, when I think of what I've heard about the agency, and you dealt with this in your opening statement, is the capacity. I'd say the kind of conventional wisdom out there is that it's still undercapacitated. That there used to be a lot more staff, yet there was more students, and so I've heard that, as the student population has declined, AOE has declined in its staffing and lockstep with that. But I just wondered if you, I know you talked about getting some of these vacancies filled, but do you feel like it's right sized right now, or do you see growing the capacity and staff that AOE is needed?
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomena. If I wasn't in the middle of it, I'd probably take a more anthropological approach to dissecting, what's behind that. Because I think I've been on the outside of the agency for the bulk of my career, and hearing and being on the receiving end of services, and I've been through that transition when the agency was much larger. Um, but I also know I sort of went in, I would say, eyes open to trying to understand that, and to understanding what the work of what we call an SEA, a state education agency, is. Um, I also, started to ask around other states, and I make the observation that, Connecticut's agency is about the same size as ours. When we talk nationally, we do have to sort of define the parameters before we can make those comparisons, because often state agencies supervise higher education. We do not, which is not uncommon. Connecticut does not. Um, Connecticut has, closer to 600,000 students. So what I started to understand pretty quickly, that the size of SEAs or agencies is not really related to number of students. It can be correlated pretty tightly to the number of school districts. So Vermont, in spite of having substantially fewer students than Connecticut, has more or less the same number of school districts. And a lot of the work we do at the agency is sort of that sub-granting or supervision of the districts. They are LEAs under federal law. We're the SEA. So that sort of interplays an important function. And, just to sort of a little bird walk on this, that we shed, I won't say shed is a polite bureaucratic term, we shed 100 school districts as a result of Act 46. That substantially increases the agency's capacity. 100 less entities to subgrant to, 100 less entities to not, supervise stat reports and so forth. That's a significant increase in capacity. But we did have the issue of vacancies. And so my first, when I was asked that when I came on board, was to say, well, what are you going to do about agency capacity? I said, well, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to fill the positions I have as quickly as I can. So, and I think that was a defendable approach. At the same time, I was always very clear with the General Assembly that, I think we're keeping the lights on, but if you ask me to do anything new, I'm going to ask for positions, because I don't think we have a lot of capacity. It is interesting to note we have taken on significant work as part of the COVID relief, without adding a whole lot of positions. We've certainly done a ton of overtime, and certainly a lot of my people are extremely worn thin at this point, like everyone. But we have taken on an extra lot of work for somehow an agency that didn't have capacity was suddenly able to do all this work, and I would argue do it exceedingly well. Is interesting observation. I would also observe that there's been a tendency to blame the agency. I mean, that is essentially, I guess, one of our functions in a local control system, is that we always are blamed for things. So, and what I had observed based on my considerable experience working outside the agency, that agency capacity is a direct mirror of local capacity as well. That our school districts are struggling to manage these complex organizations, and the agency therefore struggles as well. When we have data reporting issues, it's because the locals have data reporting issues. And, we don't necessarily have, for example, a good career path for business managers to come into those complex roles. And the agency suffers when that role isn't filled well. Similarly with special education, we suffer being able to supervise those programs. So there is a symbiotic relationship between local capacity and the agency's capacity. But I think, back to this point about initiative fatigue, we've also taken on a lot of disparate sort of programs simultaneously. I don't think no one was standing back saying, hey, is it a good idea to do district consolidation like it's never been done in 100 years, simultaneously with doing special ed reform, changing the funding system for special ed, doing pre-K changes, standing up 3 major new data systems. No one stood back and said, yeah, this agency that we're all concerned about having capacity could do all these things simultaneously, and certainly no one was standing up at the front of the pandemic saying, what would the agency need to help us get through an unprecedented global pandemic? So yeah, it's an issue. And I feel more comfortable now in my own thinking. This is coming up on my 3rd year of doing the work. I feel comfortable now. I would say more or less fully understand the agency's needs in regard to that. I am trying to do some moving within inside the agency. I think I mentioned previously on home study, for example, as an example of something that could be done in a miscellaneous ed bill. If we simplified the regulation there, we could free up some capacity. But there are areas of the agency that are better staffed than others. And it really depends on where your policy interest goes. I'll use for an example, feeding kids. Prior to the pandemic, I would say the agency didn't really have a lot of on a sort of daily sort of operational interaction with school districts. Most of what we do is administer grants and programs, and that work has a certain trajectory and sort of distance to it. An exception would be we feed kids, and we're directly involved with that on a daily basis. Well, there's been a lot of emphasis on feeding kids during and throughout the pandemic, and the agency's leadership on that has been significant. I think by September, we had requested 36 waivers from the U.S. Department of Education to keep the lights on and keep things moving. And our team in that area is pretty stressed, to do what they've done. And at the same time now, we're, as we always have been pretty much every year since I've been secretary and beforehand, considering expanding that. It's a policy commitment that's broadly supported in Vermont. And particularly, we're a national leader in farm to school. So, how would we advance that? And I can, considering local capacity versus state capacity, I think a case can be made for having additional state capacity to run those programs, but that all has to be factored in. And there's places, again, where I think we probably would need some more capacity, particularly as the policy needs change. But it's a balancing act, and it isn't as simple as just saying, oh, the agency doesn't have enough staff, because that sometimes that's a false flag a bit. For other reasons, but
no, I think that's a good point. I think what we're trying to understand and how can we be helpful, and you probably have heard that we've been talking about this idea of an agency audit at some point. I mean, what is the agency? And you're right, it's not just numbers, but somebody was here yesterday and they said, you get on the Massachusetts Agency of Education website and there's all these different literacy experts. And we don't have one person just dedicated in that way. So it is more than just numbers. It's how are people used, and how can we help all of you to use folks efficiently and in the best way possible. And we keep mentioning also this idea where if DCF, DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, they go out to look at rivers, they go out to look at the landscape, work to find areas that there may be a spill or a situation. And as the chair of this committee, I don't know if we have people that would leave the agency if a school really needed help shoring up or creating a literacy program that people are going out, are ready to go. And it's not my place really at this point to say that is really what's needed, but that's where, we want to be helpful in that way to understand, the landscape in the agency, how different people are used. Are there ways that we can be helpful to all of you going forward?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And that is some of the important work in front of us I alluded to yesterday, this issue of regulation and getting regulation aligned with statute. Mm-hmm. And, coming back to this idea of purpose statement, part of this idea of mission creep isn't really just responding to external expectations. It's also internal. So you asked a question of sort of basic functionality that an SEA would have, which is to be out in the field supervising schools on sort of to ensure basic quality. Yeah. So just to give you an example of how that plays out in Vermont, that's largely done now through a process called integrated field reviews, which was a process created under ESSA as a response to the new federal law, the successor of No Child Left Behind Act. but to understand sort of, again, pointing back to the regulatory construct, that whole process of integrated field review, which is rather complex, does not exist in regulation. So it's a process that, again, this idea that everything we do should flow from the law, flow from regulation. And it was a sort of a side conversation that emerged pretty quickly in a recent audit of the agency pertaining to regulation of independent schools. We're talking about this issue. Well, how do you go out and ensure quality of an independent school? And I did make the side observation, well, the whole process by which we supervise public schools is essentially not written down. It's doesn't exist in regulation. How can that be? So we have education quality standards that are described in regulation pretty well. But what I'm pointing to is this whole process of how do we supervise that? And what happened is that got articulated as part of our ESSA state plan. The ESSA state plan was never approved by the state board, was never approved by the General Assembly, and was never signed by the governor. So we have our essential regulatory oversight of the public school system doesn't exist anywhere of regulatory force, doesn't exist. And I have a whole division at the agency now called Education Quality that contains these teams that there is a statutory requirement for continuous improvement planning. But the work that they do through this whole integrated field review process, which is, I would argue, very good, but also very labor intensive. So we created on our own, this is sort of back to this idea of getting tight on our process. We created probably the most complex process imaginable without considering our resources. And bottom line is none of that is written down in a regulation, So pre No Child Left Behind Act, we had a process like many states that was called public school approval. And I alluded to this yesterday, where essential function of the state, I would argue, is to ensure sort of baseline quality. And that gets at the equity piece. We have some work to do, and I think this should be on the front burner, to sort out, firstly, the regulatory construct. So it's the conversation for me doesn't start with, an admiration or an audit of the agency and figuring out what you need and what you don't need. That conversation starts by what's being asked of the agency to do. What is the work we're asking you to do, and what is the work we need you to do? That's the problem right now, is that none of that's really defined, and it should be. And we used to have it defined, and we've lost sight of that. So I think that the good news is we can fix that pretty quickly. But we need, I swear we're the only state that doesn't have an ESSA plan that isn't part of a regulatory construct. So when I go to national meetings, I'm like, really? You don't, how does that work? And it would be useful for us to have that in regulation, so we knew how to pursue sort of the issues you're talking about. Then I could come back to you definitively and say, hey, I don't have enough people to do what needs to be done.
Right.
Relative to overseeing quality, but we don't have a solid description of that process, so it's hard for me to articulate the staffing.
Right. So along those lines, and then I'll pass on to Senator Lyons, I feel like we've given some real direction, the legislature in general, the General Assembly, around literacy. You've worked hard. You helped us very much focusing on that this year. The House has done its work also. You've been a big advocate in helping us to identify that this is an area that could make a real difference. So in that, talking about direction, would we expect that the agency could shift in a way, given that direction that we're talking about, to add positions, to sort of do some other beefing up in addition to what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think I try not to answer the question indirectly, but yeah. If you think about what is the agency's role in the area of curriculum, or that sort of instructional content expertise, there was a time when the agency had very limited content expertise and essentially relied on an external entity called VISMIT for that content expertise. We essentially contracted it out. And under Richard Cate's leadership, a lot of that was brought back inside the agency. So the agency had a math expert, a literacy expert. If you had a question about literacy, you'd call the agency, right? So to what extent we would have that staffing pattern? Well, in the area of the agency where that probably would be housed, we have a division called Student Pathways that's largely focused on managing the Flexible Pathways Initiative under Act 77. And that policy initiative has sort of taken over the organizational structure inside the agency that typically would have been dedicated to curriculum issues. So, again, to fit in, if we were to, if you were asked for testimony in did a poke around the policy structure around flexible pathways,
Yeah.
what's going on in that area, and how the agency should then be staffed in curriculum, I think that'd be a really useful conversation. I point back to, again, the regulatory construct. I know this committee last year was interested in the concept of proficiency-based learning. Act 77, the flexible pathways, the law says nothing about proficiency-based learning. Mm-hmm. It's a concept that only exists in state board regulation. It's never promulgated from the law. The General Assembly never said do proficiency-based learning. It's something the agency through the state board, in cooperation of the field, their advocacy, put proficiency-based learning in regulation. But the response is the agency now has staff dedicated to doing this regulatory activity that is not expressed anywhere in statute as a priority. Mm-hmm. So is it a question of adding more staff, perhaps, or is it a question of looking at what we have already and saying, stop doing this and start doing that, or figure out how to shift and incorporate literacy into that construct? I'd also mention the idea that the agency sort of has the expertise is sort of outdated, and I would challenge you to look out nationally and see that as well, because I think it's similar to the idea that the only place you can find knowledge is in a schoolhouse back in the 1800s. Like, you sent your kids down to the school in the village because that's where the people who went to college and have books, that's where the books are, so you have to go down into the village. There's more expertise out there now than is housed centrally. We do need to have expertise to help make sense of everything that's out there and bring that down to coherence for folks. And just to chase myself back around on the argument, excuse me, it's hard for me to imagine that literacy wouldn't be a priority for staffing in the agency. Sure. Relative to how its need is and how it functions relative to the rest of the education process. And we do have some people in staff that have that background, but it hasn't been elevated to the literacy person in the state. So anyway, complex answer. But those priorities, in my view, getting back to the regulatory construct, it would be helpful to get tighter on what are the expectations for quality, have the regulations support that, then the agency staffing would be articulated to enact that supervision and accountability.
Thank you. Senator Lyons.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Senator Campion already asked one of my questions, so I just have one question. Obviously, COVID has really exacerbated a lot of problems, and not the least of which is the mental health and welfare of our kids. But as you're looking at the future for our schools, what are you thinking about? How can we build a trauma-informed culture within all of our schools and each of our schools? So just some thoughts about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you. I think that work fits into the scope of work around Act 173, which is special education reform, ostensibly, but is really, and that gets us into the weighting study, which is behind it as well. And there was a hypothesis in the weighting study and we do see, I should say, in the data behind the weighting study, in UVM's report, that Vermont over-identifies emotionally disturbed. I would say potentially over-identifies. We have a higher rate of identification of emotionally disturbed students than our New England neighbors. And what's the cause of that? The UVM study basically has a hypothesis that perhaps the cause of that is that the only way we can get services delivered is to qualify those students as special education, because the districts don't have any other funding source available, and schools, will pull that down through the funding process of the Ed Fund to meet the needs of those students. So Act 173, I think, provides the construct of which, firstly, we can look at the cost structures, because some of what we have to consider is how Medicaid is used in schools, how is special ed funded, and so forth. But an important part of 173 is also to talk about the professional development and sort of systems development, if you will, that needs to occur in advance of special education. And we have a policy commitment to that in Vermont, a longstanding one called multi-tiered support systems. And what we've been trying to do with school districts, and I think this is, the pandemic sort of disrupted that to a certain extent, but also I think will also accelerate our work in this area. As you point to, I think the pandemic's, exacerbated many of the concerns that were there previously. But a central sort of theory of action in 173 is to look at something like a multi-tier support system, which we have a ton of stuff on. It's been a policy commitment for over 20 years in Vermont, but it's largely been enacted on a school by school basis, not a school district by school district basis. So we're trying to build that capacity starting at the district level, and then have districts sort of look at their schools from a support system structure. And I think that's important because by elevating that to a district level concern, it provides a much more efficient way for us on a regional basis to bring other state agencies involved, including mental health. So instead of each school sort of fighting for its own services, we start to look at a system, a school district system, which by definition has more of a regional footprint that might fit better with the delivery of other social services. So I think, hopefully through the work of 173 and what we're working on now, as we sort of formulate the recovery priorities, we're doing parallel planning in special education right now. But if we're successful in leveraging our ESSER funds and working through this recovery, and at the same time following sort of the roadmap highlighted in Act 173, we're going to come out the other end of this emergency response with stronger school district systems that are integrated social service delivery models, where school districts, as opposed to schools, are sort of looking at all the issues of the students in all their schools and are interacting more regularly with those state agencies, and also prioritizing the needs of students across an entire system as opposed to a building. And I think that variation isn't necessarily represented in the more densely populated areas of our state. But as you get out beyond Chittenden County into the rural landscape, you have a number of variables that are fluctuating fairly regularly. You have staffing that I alluded to. You have principals turning over on a 20% basis. So it's really hard to make traction on a support system at a school basis when the school leader itself is changing regularly. So part of the strategy, again, of putting it to the district level is that insulates from that variability of staffing. But also in the rural landscape, you have more variability in the pupils. So it was not unusual to see districts, for instance, or a school try to stand up an autism program for one student. And they do that. It takes them several years to get it together. And I've been in this place, so I'm speaking from personal experience. And then the student leaves, and what do? You dismantle the program because you don't need it anymore. And 2 years later, you have another student come in and you try to set the whole thing up again and build those partnerships and wrap around and so forth. So districts, when you start positioning these kind of ideas at the district level, you start to address issues of the instability in both staffing and pupils that come through your door. And it creates a better support structure and professionalization, if you will, of those services, which no doubt will contribute to cost containment. But more importantly, it provides a more responsive and supportive framework for both parents and students. So instead of parents, of some of our most needy students having to be sort of the lead advocates for school districts to create a program, you have a program that's already built around the assumption there's going to be X number of students in this area of, let's say, the autistic needs, the spectrum, and the district's able to accommodate most students more directly. So I think, that's a long-winded answer, I think, but my hope is that we come out the end of this pandemic with stronger school district systems that are able to articulate multi-tiered support systems in partnership with other state agencies, and have that be a very stable system. I mean, too often in my experience as a leader, every time I'd come into a new position, I'd have to create a new system, and there wasn't one waiting for me when I got there. So it's a challenge in Vermont, particularly with leadership turnover.
Other questions, committee members? Senator Perslow, please.
I haven't heard you talk about the tech centers, I don't think, in the past. So I wondered if you could give us your quick take on where you see those going, or your view on this.
Sure. I think the larger, let's say, historical moment in education is about, let's say, personalizing education or making education more responsive to the individual needs. And that should really be our guidepost in Vermont. And not just to set aside as an education goal, but as a social and economic goal as well. I mean, that's what education's always been about, cultivating the individual. But too often the structures of the system are hard to move, and particularly with technology today, I think we have some new opportunity to sort of circle back around and try to redesign the system around the needs of the individual. And I think what that means in tech ed in particular, we see and we know there are these barriers to access. Some of them are overt, and some of them are less apparent. What I mean by overt, we know that the funding system, for example, provides, I think, a disincentive for ascending high school to send their students to tech center because basically financially they're harmed by that decision. Less overt are just sort of the biases many of our, I would say, in our traditional academic system, because most of us work in schools, come from that traditional system and admire that traditional system. We tend to not see some of that tech opportunity as a viable pathway. And our new CT centers, if you've been in them, these are very state-of-the-art pieces of infrastructure that really need to be leveraged and be available. And I'm struck when I look at other countries in particular, how flexible that is. I think we still conceptualize it it's a pathway. It's like one way or the other. When I was visiting Finland several years ago, one of the things I noticed was that people have the opportunity to dip in and out of different parts of the system. So if you want to go to a tech center and take a couple classes, you can go back to the traditional academic high school. You go on as an adult and come back and take courses at tech centers. And we do some of that as Vermont as well. But we still have structural barriers, and largely because of the sparsity of our populations. It's challenging to come up with a viable model for a regional tech center when you're dependent on these sort of regional fluctuations in demographics, which student populations have been declining. And it's hard to force those changes at the local level to a certain extent, because everyone's particularly with declining enrollment, sort of protecting their turf, and everyone thinks, and they're all doing great work, but it's harder to look more strategically on those regional bases. But I think so. To answer your question, I think we have a couple things we need to do. Firstly, is just the ongoing promotion of these programs as really being viable, not just for let's say the non-traditional college student, but for all students. And I would believe that, personally, I would have benefited by going down that route. I think there's many of our so-called professions that really are tech ed professions. I know Germany, for example, used to do banking as a tech ed program, that you would start your career through a tech center, become a teller, work your way up through management, and the bank would send you to England to learn how to, that career pathway was well articulated, not you go get an MBA and then we teach you how to run a bank. So there's many pathways like that I think are viable, but particularly for Vermont, we always say that a lot of Vermont students would really benefit from more access to those programs. And I think that's true. And I think our adult population in terms of adult learning would benefit from more broadly deploying those programs. So part of it's promotion, but part of it is looking at the structural barriers. We didn't get a chance this session to talk about the funding piece, but we have some of the districts that were involved in a pilot project around CTE, commissioned Bill Talbot to do some analysis. So we have some of that to share with you at some point when we have more time to get into a technical policy area. And that would get at the issue of the financial disincentive from a high school perspective. It sort of puts the cost of this deeper in the background, so it wouldn't be readily apparent in the school district budget. So I think it's a critical piece going forward, as particularly in our demographic challenges. But it's all part of that personalization piece and knocking down some of the barriers. We have the same issues on pre-K. Pre-K, the transition from early learning and care to pre-K, those barriers, those structural barriers as well. And similarly from CTE and then CTE to higher ed.
Okay, thanks. I'm glad to hear about you're thinking about the funding, because I have heard about that, and look forward to that discussion in the future.
Thank you. Senator Chittenden.
Secretary French, thank you. I remember yesterday when you were before us, you made a comment about local control, and I also heard in a couple of your responses so far you've spoken to that. I was wondering if you could speak to one impression that I have from both my municipal service and then also in the short time on Senate Education. And can you tell me how you feel local control intersects or has a healthy tension with equitable access to educational opportunities? And what is the role in your mind, as you see the Agency of Education, in navigating the local controls that might also either not inhibit but somehow affect making decisions over what opportunities are available in all of our schools, and how do we ensure greater equity across all of our different school districts?
Yeah, it's a complex question, and it's these are the things I ponder when I'm sitting in a parking lot at a school board meeting, or my fourth school board meeting in a night, that kind of thing, when I was a superintendent. And I think, to sort of, and I've had the opportunity working in higher ed, which I know you have as well, or do, teaching school leadership and teaching education law. So I've had the opportunity to reflect upon my practice from a theoretical perspective as well. And the way I think of it, and I would say by just introduction, now that we're getting towards the end of this conversation, I started my career with Act 60. I came over from New Hampshire as a teacher. I arrived in Vermont with Act 60, and I ended my career as a superintendent, for the moment anyway, with Act 46. So those are sort of the bookends of my career. And so I paid a lot of attention to the Brigham decision and, the Vermont Constitution, because I lived through, that experience of having to explain at people's kitchen tables how come they're a gold town and they live in the town of Leamington and there's no gold in Leamington, but how come they're a gold town? So theoretically, I'd start with the fact that it's been settled, and I think that the court decision in Act 46 supports this conclusion that, firstly, in the Vermont Constitution, it's settled that the state is ultimately responsible for the education of students. The state is responsible, ultimately, and the state cannot delegate its responsibility. It can, however, delegate specific authority to locals to enact that responsibility, and that's the key distinction. So the state, when it delegates that authority, does so very intentionally. And we do that because I think of our rural landscape, that there is just from an operational standpoint, there's a real diversity in our communities in terms of the circumstances in which they're situated. But we also have a tradition of local control and democracy that requires the enactment of those values and the practicing of those values on a daily basis. So school boards are a training ground, and schoolhouses, to Dewey, our great theorist, the education is a practicing ground for democracy. So we understand our cultural limitations on sort of the boundaries of that delegation of authority, but the state's ultimately responsible. We delegate that responsibility or the authority over certain elements, and when we do so very intentionally. And I think, again, this is essentially the role of the state then to make sure that locals are fulfilling those specific responsibilities, and that's local control does not mean you do whatever you want to do. We don't have home rule. When the state delegates responsibility, you have to ensure you're following those rules. And that's the piece I think that's been, I would say, fragile in Vermont. It's been a sense of some dynamism, because having been as a superintendent, living in the kingdom, essentially without any other support agencies up in Canaan, I was the law for all intents and purposes in terms of implementing the Constitution and the Green Book of Title 16. So I had to be well versed in, how to negotiate people into complying with law. But it's important that, particularly from an SEA perspective, for us to understand that the law is the basis of social justice and equity. So when we start throwing equity around, and our commitment to ensuring, and this is in the Constitution, that this idea that whatever the state does has to sort of benefit everyone equal, there's a state responsibility there that implies that we have to supervise that delegation of authority to the locals. And that is the role of the agency, essentially, to ensure that locals are complying with those standards. And that's the function of regulation that I'm alluding to. And right now, I often am brought before Senate committees and other aspects of the legislature to be held accountable for that supervision of regulation. But they are regulations I do not control. They're controlled by the state board, and that's worked out very well for us for the last 100 some odd years. But it's an important distinction to consider, is that if we're really committed to the issue of equity, that means we have to require districts to follow the law, essentially, in the cases where we delegate it to them. And it's important that we do that delegation, because we can't have a democratic society without allowing them that sort of latitude and to figure out how to apply the broader broader societal commitments to equal opportunity that exists in the Constitution. But there's a tension there, and your question speaks to that. And I think increasingly, where I'm at that part of my career when I can say I'm losing my patience, but having been a superintendent for a district that had 56 board members and 12 boards, I think that's a fair conclusion on my part to be a little impatient. But we talk a lot about equity in the state, but we're uncomfortable with pushing the boundary a little bit on requiring people to address those issues, and I'm increasingly dissatisfied as I mentioned, I'm a technologist. And I think, as I've said today, this opportunity before us around designing a system around individuals, I question whether a lot of the structures and routines we have are really aligned with that. And actually, if you want to talk about issues of equity, I would point to the structure that we have as being the cause of a lot of that inequity. It's not because in people's hearts they don't believe in equal opportunity. They're more enamored with the structure than they are with actually delivering on our ideals. And that's the challenge for us.
Going forward, Mr. Secretary, I would say that, and you touched on this a little bit, but like a lot of policy committees, there's always, and I don't mean this to be negative, because I feel like we're always working toward improving education, but there can be some noise sometimes, and for us, and again, I want to thank you for helping us focus on something like literacy, where we know that if we make this improvement, we are going to really help prepare young people for a better future. They can work in a number of different. I said to the chair of PROPS this morning, you can't read the Federalist Papers and get engaged in civic education if you're not reading and writing at grade level. So that's a really important step. And I want to thank you again for your help. And I think just going forward, we'll look for other things, and we'll be looking to you to help us pull some of those triggers, help identify some of those areas where we really can, getting back to the basics, you know what I mean by that, and I mean it in a more complex way than I'm saying it. But if you would just continue to keep your eye open and keep thinking about that with us, I know we would really appreciate it.
Yeah, by all means, I think that's part of the responsibility of secretary to, in the case of literacy, just looking at the data, it does jump out at, we should be doing better in that area. And I think, having worked more with school boards, I see, governance and perhaps the function of the General Assembly to be asking those questions. It's like, well, why aren't we doing better?
Yeah.
What do we need to do in order to make that happen? But also, I would encourage you to circle back around. If you do enact a policy on literacy, to think about how will you know that policy's been successful or not.
Yeah.
Because I've proposed some approaches on literacy that aren't necessarily the same, and that's no harm, no foul. My ideas, my responsibility is just to put some ideas on your table that I think will work. But I would think as a regular sort of approach to your monitoring of that, if you will, that you're always asking the question, did it happen? And I think literacy is one of those areas that will help us unpack things like 173 and Act 46, because it just sort of, it transcends, you use the word noise, it sort of transcends all that and says, well, regardless of all this stuff,
Right.
let's focus on this idea. And I would say, I've been privileged to work on literacy nationally a bit as secretary, and a lot of my colleagues, you hear it referenced now as being a civil right.
Yes.
This idea of literacy, if you are not, you mentioned reading the Federalist Papers, but so much of our world today is technology driven, which comes with technical documentation and manuals. Even getting vaccinated, if you can't navigate that website and get vaccinated, it's tough. I work with my parents who are in their 90s to do that down in Florida. Increasingly, I don't know if you're not a fluent technical reader, I don't know how you survive. And, there's been a lot of attention on media literacy, but media literacy is really about literacy, regular literacy. It's like you have to be an intelligent consumer of written word. And that expectation has increased, if nothing else, with a reliance on technology. So we need to, and we have this disconnect in Vermont, I should say also, if you haven't observed it yet, but we have one of the highest adult literacy rates of any state in the country. But our outcomes at the third grade level are relatively low, so it's an interesting tension to unpack a little bit.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I don't see any other questions. I think this is a good spot to, Senator Hooker, did you want to have a final word?
Just a comment about
Please.
Circling back with regard to, what's the cause of the literacy problem that we have, and I'll go back to Senator Lyons, and she's always bringing up social determinants, and I think that we
Yes.
have to look at those causes and make those connections. But yeah, a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I think our final request of you prior to our vote, which I'll ask Jeannie to put on our calendar for Tuesday, is if you wouldn't mind just supplying us with a CV, something that we can use, share with one another, but also on the floor when we talk about your history in education and your interest in returning to this position. So
Happy to do that.
that was terrific. Thanks, everybody, and special thanks to you, Mr. French.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. Committee, let's shift gears. And as we know, the House has sent us two bills, one of which we've been working on, which is this school construction bill. The other bill that they sent us is on community schools, a pilot program that would allow our schools to access dollars, ESSER dollars, and put a community school director in schools to help really provide the resources that so many of our students need. So I'm not sure whose phone is ringing, but Mr. Francis, if you wouldn't mind turning that off.
Hi, Dan.
Thank you. I think
Hang on one sec. I gotta.
going to.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
We're going to start with Mr. Racine, who's joining us.
Okay.
Great to see you, Doug. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate your patience. As you know, we are talking about community schools, something that you're very interested in, and looking forward to hearing from you. So the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you. And for your record, Doug Racine, former Secretary of Agency of Human Services, former Lieutenant Governor, and 7-term member of the Senate, including time on Health and Welfare Committee with Senator Lyons. And I also appreciate the fact that as we go into this issue, H106, it seems we have a quorum of the Health and Welfare Committee with us today as well. So I think that's really helpful, because I see H106 as being as much a human services issue, and perhaps even more so than an education issue. As I really appreciated listening in with Secretary French. A lot of what he said is very consistent with the thinking that is behind H106, Community Schools Bill. A couple of points that he made is we really need systems built around our schools and our students to help with the issues that are barriers to children getting good education. And he talked at the end of his remarks a lot about equal opportunity and the state's responsibility. And I think we all understand right now and see that equal opportunity is not something that exists throughout the state of Vermont. And primarily children who have come from low-income homes, poverty, homes with a lot of poverty and a lot of dysfunction. Those are the kids who we are failing and giving an opportunity for a good education. H106 to me could be one of the most significant pieces of legislation passed this year outside of the COVID legislation, in that it's an opportunity to build back better, which I think is the mantra coming out of just about everybody in state government and outside of state government as well. To me, it's an opportunity to make sure that we are using our schools and our human services effectively to help every child succeed and have that opportunity for the American dream that I enjoyed growing up, and I think most of us here have enjoyed. When I was Secretary of the Agency of Human Services, it was painfully obvious to me, and it was probably just as obvious when I was serving in the Senate, that poverty is related to most of the issues that the Agency of Human Services deals with. Certainly DCF, but also corrections. I think it's well over 90% of those folks incarcerated do not have a high school diploma, which tells us something about some of the lasting impacts of poverty if we aren't dealing with it. But it's also the achievement gap or the opportunity gap. It's all been called both things over time. We use different words at different times. But that achievement gap has existed since we started doing, or it's been recognized since we started doing standardized testing. It's the case. Every secretary or commissioner of education talks about the need to help those kids who are living in poverty, those who are, the measure we use, those who are eligible for free and reduced lunches. But again, in my experience is the mental health issues, the achievement gap issues, a lot of special ed costs are related to poverty. And then later on in life, substance abuse problems, the poor physical health, our Medicaid budget, some child abuse, it goes on and on and on. And the way to get at prevention of a lot of these problems is to help kids succeed in school. And for kids to succeed in school, they need the supports that H106 promises them. I don't know how much you've heard from experts about the community schools concept, but it is an opportunity to bring the services that should be available to kids into the school buildings so they're readily accessible. And Senator Campion, you pointed out that I've been interested in this. I was there at, helping Sue McGuire as much as I possibly could down in the Molly Stark Elementary School in your community of Bennington, but building that very model, bringing in all sorts of services, and she did it on her own. There wasn't anybody at the state helping her, or nobody's then the Department of Education. She was pulling it all together in a very entrepreneurial way, but she recognized that kids needed a lot of additional supports if she was going to be successful in helping them get a good education. And all of these issues have become even more apparent and more severe with the pandemic. Lots of studies out there right now. I read one just the other day that came from McKinsey, which is a large management company that talks about how much students have lost in their learning since the pandemic began. And it's obviously worse for those kids who are living in poverty, and it takes on all the racial issues as well that other areas of the country experience even more than we do. I think there are a lot of good reasons to support this bill, which I hope you will, obviously. It's, as I said, it's an opportunity to address the lasting impacts of poverty, those things that get in the way. Even if President Biden is successful in reducing childhood poverty by 50%, which is an admirable goal, there's still the 50% that are going to be living in poverty. And those who have started in poverty are going to experience some of those lasting impacts of the childhood traumas that can get in the way. It's an opportunity for a better provision of Agency of Human Services programs. As former secretary, I see this as an opportunity to bring a lot of human services programs into the schools where they are most needed. I mean, the programs aimed at children are by and large offered outside of the schools. Well, where can you get the children most easily? Where can you get at them? It's obviously in the schools. So I see an opportunity for better provision, more effectiveness of those services, and frankly, more cost effectiveness of those services as well. The vision I see in H106 is a central place for services. You know, since last March, a lot of state employees in the Agency of Human Services, particularly in the economic services arena, have been operating out of their homes. There's no reason why they can't be operating out of their schools. And when parents dropping their kids off at school, picking their kids up at school, or coming to the school for teacher meetings, they could be filling out their forms and meeting with their case managers and getting the services there, particularly in rural areas where transportation is a major issue for people to receive services. It allows us to tear down silos. If you build programs or try to build programs around the children rather than for bureaucratic convenience, the school is an ideal place to bring all the various people who are involved in a child's life, the parents, the providers, the therapists, and everyone else associated, bring them all together in one place. The other thing I really like about this is the other opportunities that are ancillary, but I think have tremendous promise using our community assets, our school buildings, for other services besides just education. And as we're seeing a lot of pressure to close smaller rural schools, here's an opportunity to keep those schools open, even though perhaps the number of students might be declining. The state could actually pay rent to the school districts to use those buildings for the provision of various services. You could cut down on the number of offices needed that the state uses in their state office buildings. And instead of paying the money for the rent, as we do in a lot of those buildings, we could be paying school districts as a way of keeping those school buildings open. We talk a lot about broadband and attracting young families into Vermont and live in our rural areas. They aren't coming if they don't have, if there aren't schools in their communities for their kids. You aren't going to get somebody to move into a town, even if it's got great broadband, to work online all over, connecting with people all over the world, if every morning they put their 6 and 7-year-old children on a school bus for an hour. It's just not going to happen. So let's use this as an opportunity to find more creative and entrepreneurial ways to keep our schools, our small schools, viable. But it's an idea that works in the more urbanized areas of the state as well as the more rural areas. It recognizes that, same time, it recognizes that we've been, and I think Secretary French talked about this, we've been providing education for essentially the same way for several generations now. It's not working as well as it should. This is an opportunity to sort of re-envision how education is provided. It's an opportunity to have our school systems be more adaptive. Not only do I have a political and government background, I have a business background. And I got to tell you, and I think anybody who's been in business knows, if you aren't adapting to changes going on around you in technology and knowledge, you aren't going to survive. And we have not been very adaptive in how we provide services to our children in our schools or in our human services programs. I have a few suggestions on the bill, which I think is a good bill as it is, but I think there are a few things that could be done to make it even stronger and reflect some of the ideas that I just talked about. One of the things that occurred to me while Secretary French was talking with you was the bill is aimed at either individual schools or school districts. And you might consider aiming this at school districts to build those kinds of systems that he was talking about that would, instead of just aiming it at one school with a principal that, as he knows, very recognized, can come and go over time. Building it into the system of a larger administrative unit, I think could be an improvement in that bill and make it more likely to succeed. He talked about multi-tiered support systems. I kind of like that idea. It sounds kind of bureaucratic, but I think it reflects the reality of what is needed in our schools. The other thing I would recommend, and I did with the House committee, and they sort of ran out of time with crossover deadline, but I think there needs to be a very clear and specific link in this legislation to the Agency of Human Services. As I said, I think this is primarily a human services bill. We're talking about the mental health services that are needed, some of the economic services that are needed, the physical health services that kids need to succeed. Those are all in they're in the seeing Senator Lyons nodding her head. They're all in the purview of the Committee on Health and Welfare. So I think a really clear link to that, make them part of the planning process, part of the grant making process. There are great opportunities there. The state signs contracts every year with our local mental health agencies, for example. There's no reason why the state couldn't write into those contracts that some of the services that the state's paying for will be provided in our school buildings directly to the kids in those schools. The employees of the mental health agencies could be in small schools, they could be rotating from school to school within a district, or they could, in some of our larger schools, they could just be embedded inside that school system. Right now, teachers who are encountering kids with some mental health issues might hear, well, it's got to leave every Wednesday afternoon for mental health counseling down in Burlington or Rutland or Bennington or where have you. Having those services right there in the schools, having that be an expectation of the contracts with our mental health agencies is one possibility. But to explore those possibilities, I think there needs to be a very clear connection and responsibility for the Agency of Education to be working with the Agency of Human Services. And I even have a suggestion for you. A bill that passed a couple of years ago created a Director of Trauma Prevention and Resilience Development in the agency, yes, Senator Lyons, within the Secretary's office in the Agency of Human Services. And it talks about things like the responsibilities to collaborate with both community and state partners, including the Agency of Education. It's right, it's right there that that connection is envisioned in that trauma coordinator. So just in the sub B, the director shall add it as another one that person shall coordinate within the Agency of the people in the Agency of Education to put these plans together and help school districts realize the full potentials of our human services programs. You might also, sort of a side thought here, there might even be an agency of administration link as well. If you start thinking about the possibilities of using our schools as community hubs, community centers, not just for education, human services, but there's no reason why there couldn't be circuit riders out of the Department of Motor Vehicles to help people get their licenses in an unused room in a school building. They could bring their cameras and all of their computers in and provide services closer to people in Vermont, rather than having to stand in line for 2 hours at the Department of Motor Vehicles in Montpelier. Another thing I think is really important, and Secretary French actually mentioned this, while not in response or connection with this bill. He asked that, he says, we're staffed okay, but don't ask us to do anything new. H106 is something new. When you look at what's required, they've got to put plans together. They've got to put grant applications together. They've got to evaluate grant applications. They got to monitor the grants. They've got to write reports. That can't be done by the Secretary of Education. I think a dedicated position would be really important. He might come back at you and say, oh, he doesn't need it. He'll fit it in. He'll figure out how to do it. Because having worked in the executive branch, that's what secretaries and commissioners hear. When somebody in the legislature says, can you do this without any new positions? They say, we were told, and I was one of the we, sure, we can do it without any new positions. We'll figure it out. It's not real. And for this to work effectively, if you want this to be an effective program, I believe there needs to be a position created. You can create a temporary position. This is a 3-year demonstration program. Create a temporary position, but don't just hand it to the secretary and say, you figure it out, because without a dedicated person on this, it's not going to be successful. The other thing is, if I don't know who else is listening in on this, but you can't put this in legislation, but it needs to be talked about. This will not happen successfully without the active leadership of our school boards, our superintendents, and our principals. And Senator Campion, I think you know what happened down in Molly Stark. It was the principal who made this happen. She was absolutely committed to making it happen. So there definitely needs to be a way to reach out to the associations of school boards, superintendents, and principals to find ways to get them fully on board so that they can make this happen. Because sadly, I've encountered some around the state, and for many years I traveled around the state and I visited a lot of schools. I encountered a lot of administrators, at least 10 years ago, who quite bluntly said, these issues are not school issues. They don't want anything to do with it. They just said, we're here to teach the ABCs, and what happens outside the school is outside the school. It's not our responsibility. I once had a superintendent suggest to me that so long as the dropout rate in their school was below the state average, that was acceptable. ignoring the couple of dozen of kids who dropped out every year as though, well, just as long as our statistics are good. That's not the kind of leadership that we need to make something like this very effective. And the last thing, and I'll stop, is when the bill was originally drafted, it used the education fund. And I suggested, and I think others suggested, that we try to use some of the federal money that's out there right now. There's a temptation to use the education fund as a way of avoiding using general fund money. And that's been done a whole lot over the years. And I think it's been overdone, quite frankly. And I will claim my share of credit for it because I was there when a lot of these things were shifted. But these are human services issues. These are the mental health issues that kids are facing, the physical health issues. The burden should not be placed on property tax payers who, when they feel that kind of direct pressure, are pushing school districts to cut these kinds of services. So I think it's important for the legislature and the governor, if this bill is to be backed on similar bills, is to put the responsibility on the Agency of Human Services and the funding that comes through the general fund and other state taxes, but not the property tax. So anyway, I'll just end by saying I think it's a great bill. It's very exciting. I think it creates the possibility of providing education and human services more effectively, modernize the management of these programs of our schools, and in the bottom line will be much more effective in helping our kids achieve that promise of the American dream. I thank you for listening.
All right, thank you. And if you wouldn't mind forwarding that testimony to our committee assistant, that would be really helpful, Senator.
I'll be happy to write it because I just talk.
Yes, I appreciate
talk from notes, so I will try to write it up as I be true to what I just said to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering, so I mean, again, it's a demonstration program. Two things are coming to my mind, and this is where Sue McGuire from Molly Stark will also be helpful. How do we measure whether or not this was successful? We've been talking a lot about, these are great ideas. How do we look back and say, we met certain goals, whatever they might be? And then how does this not end up on the, again, it's a pilot program. So we're trying to prove that this kind of idea works. I appreciate what you said about federal funds, but federal funds are going to quickly run out at the end of these 3 years. So why do it if we know that there is no additional funding after 3 years? Why go through this process, if you will? Just to I feel like in a way, are we setting people up for disappointment?
We often do that. I was never a fan of when I was secretary. I was never a fan of demonstration projects and pilot programs for just that reason.
Right.
And I often use that if I ever win the lottery, I wanted to set up what I call the year 4 foundation, which is after 3 years of foundation funding and the foundations go away.
Yes.
Help them pay for it in the year 4, 5, and 6, and so on. It's a fair question. First, I think there's some folks who are really expert in this concept. The House Committee heard from many of them, so you could check with some of them. But there's something called the Learning Policy Institute out there that has done research on this and talks about the effectiveness and has looked at the outcomes from these programs in other school districts. And it might be worthwhile to engage with one of them, the legislature engaged. So you're doing your own independent review of this, but put somebody like this under a small contract to set some parameters and that you can measure by to make your own determination after 1 or 2 or 3 years whether this has been effective. As far as funding goes, I wouldn't guarantee this as a former secretary, but I think the agency could actually save money by providing services in these ways. It's an opportunity. This gets into a bigger issue that I've been beating on for years, as Senator Lyons knows, because she's listened to me many times talk about this. But the Agency of Human Services is not structured and managed in an efficient way. It's managed in silos. And every program works in its silo.
Mhm.
And they may be very effective in providing their individual services, but they don't fit together very effectively. Somebody working with a reach up client, for example, does not know whether that person or that members of that person's family are receiving mental health services. So they never can really, or substance abuse services, or there's a family member in corrections, because the computers don't talk to each other. We don't build our services around individuals and families. We build our services, what I could say, for bureaucratic convenience. And I think there's potential for tremendous savings. And by re-envisioning how we provide services and providing some of those services in our schools and building teams around those individuals who are receiving services, I think we could be more effective and more efficient. It's not a great answer for you, Senator, because
No, I appreciate the honesty, and
Yeah.
you know, we'll dig into this a little bit more. I'm just
Yeah.
looking at our clock, and we would love to have you continue, but any pressing questions for Senator Racine or comments before we move on? We have until about 3:45 at the latest to take this up. Senator Lyons.
Yeah, I can't resist making a comment, but, as usual, I agree with Lieutenant Governor, Senator.
Secretary, whatever,
Secretary.
hey, you.
Yes, well, and the reason that we put the trauma position into the secretary's office in the first place was to build a trauma-informed culture within the agency. And
Correct.
that is one of the reasons why I actually asked the question of the secretary today about building a trauma-informed culture in schools. A somewhat satisfactory, but not completely satisfactory answer. And then the other position you mentioned, which is our chief prevention officer in the office of the administration in the governor's office, is someone who does work to build, to break down silos. And so I couldn't agree with you more, but we all understand that when we invest in prevention, we understand the difficulty of measuring the benefit, and it takes years to do that. So having a short-term pilot program may not provide the benefit that we would like, but something has to happen. I think you're absolutely right. Something has to happen. I do have a question for you, actually. So kind of a paradox, because you mentioned not using education resources, but it is the responsibility of schools to provide that human culture for student success. So I know there are tensions around this all the time, and we hear about it all the time. Schools are not the place for, or can't do all of the mental health and social service work that we would like, and yet we demand that they pay for it. So that's the paradox. That's all.
I'm not sure I have much of a response to that, because
No, you don't have to.
no, but you're right. But what's happened with Act 60 is what the opponents of Act 60 said at the time, which is once the state gets its hands on the property tax, it will be used for other services as well. And it drives up it's driving up our property tax, which is, even though it's income-based for a lot of people, it's still a regressive tax. And it's a tax when state government assigns more responsibilities to our school districts. It's doing so without taking responsibility for the tax increase that goes along with it. And it just shifts it to the local level. And I think we all know, because we all go to our school board meetings and we all hear from our school boards constantly, that they are under incredible pressure to keep property taxes down. And what happens is a lot of programs for low-income kids get cut in the process. So I think it's incumbent upon state government to provide the funding for those services that are really human services. And I'm thinking mostly in the mental health arena and the health arena. You And I understand that, a child with a toothache is not going to be able to learn anything that particular day. And if there's a dentist that comes by the school once a week, that's going to be really helpful. But that's not an education service. So it is a paradox, Senator. I just feel that there needs to be some recognition that these are programs that should be funded through the Agency of Human Services.
And I couldn't agree with you more, but we need to be able to integrate those without detracting from all of the community services that we're facing right now as well. It's just a really big area of concern.
It's a tough area. Most of what the Agency of Human Services and its partners do is deal with people in crisis. We do not do a whole lot in the area of prevention. And that's especially true over the years in children's mental health services. When the child's in crisis, then there's services available, but we haven't put a whole lot into prevention. And, look at the discussion of mental health right now. What are we talking about most is building another very expensive to build and expensive to operate state hospital for 50 or extension of it for 50 people. And that takes money away from the prevention of prevention programs that keep people out of the state hospital. We're always spending money on the crisis and not on the prevention. So it's hard to make investments. Governor Snelling way back when said, we don't have enough money in the budget to prevent all the problems and save all the money that prevention could give us. But I think we need to try.
That we're going to have as your closing line, I'm afraid, Mr. Secretary, because I need to move us along. We have about 15 minutes left on this topic. Thanks for coming in. And
thank you.
We'll look forward to your additional testimony. Mr. Francis, Ms. Siglowski, Mr. Nichols, and Mr. Robinson, I am sorry that we are tight on the calendar because we have a lift for appropriations coming up at 3:45 with VSAC. And then we are returning to S100. And I know a number of individuals have a pre-5 o'clock deadline. So I'm hoping we can get through everyone. If not, we will reschedule. So keep that in mind as you are giving your testimony. If you could give us new information, we don't need to hear anything else if you agree with Secretary Racine. But new information and concerns and edits, I would say. So with that, Mr. Francis, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to speak for 1 minute only. We supported H106 as it emerged from the House, continue to support it. I think 3 key words are community, replicability, and innovation. And for that reason, I think a simpler bill is better. The bill that the House sent to you is pretty streamlined. The goal here is to use school districts as centers of innovation in serving communities in a holistic way. And there's a lot of ways to do that. In the House, we testified that the title of the bill should change from pilot to demonstration, because really what we're trying to do is induce districts to bring themselves into the community mindset, much the way Lieutenant Governor Racine, I didn't know what to call him, Lieutenant Governor Racine spoke with you about. So my urging would be, don't make too many changes to the bill, if any. Let it go into play and allow school districts to respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. Mr. Nichols. Good to see you.
Echo what Senator Racine, I call him Senator Racine, what Senator Racine said. Also, what Jeff said, we did testimony together, our organizations, along with the Vermont Council of Special Education Administrators in the House Ed. We worked closely with Representative James on the bill. And I sent Jeannie earlier today our shared testimony that she can share with each of you, that you can look at and see, the feedback that we gave the House in relationship to the original bill as introduced, the changes they made, related to that. And as Jeff said, we support the bill. And again, we don't think there needs to be a lot of changes. It's a demonstration project. Let's let it play out and see what happens. And again, we think it's a step in the right direction. And I'll stop there.
So, Mr. Nichols, you do have a few suggestions. The VPA will have a few suggestions. Is that what you're saying?
No, I don't think no.
Okay.
I think the way it is right now, we would be happy with it being implemented the way that it is right now.
Okay, terrific. Ms. Siglowski, good to see you.
Thank you very much. We also support the bill as passed by the House, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Mr. Robinson.
Good to see everybody. Colin Robinson from Vermont NEA. It's been a while since I've been here. So very excited that you all are taking up this bill. We've been working with Representative James since back in the fall of 2019 on this concept. And our members have been deeply engaged in trying to figure out how to support students' social and emotional health for a long time. So there are a couple specific adjustments that we think would be useful to consider and encourage and hope that your committee would look at. One is recognizing, kind of zooming back, the community schools model is a national model. There are about 5,000 community schools across the nation. And there are specific things that have been shown to be effective and really critical for the success that that we know that we all want in this demonstration project. And part of that's really centering it in community. So one that's already in the bill is having a dedicated person to do this work, the community schools coordinator. One thing that was in the original bill is introduced, but was streamlined out of it that we think would actually be critical to put back in is some type of site-based leadership team or school-based leadership team. The idea here is that that is a team of parents, students, community members, other stakeholders, local agencies that the community schools coordinator would be working with to develop the plan that's going to be best for their community. I think as Jeff Francis just pointed out, what is the part of the promise and excitement of this model is that no one community school is the same because they are responsive to the needs of the students and communities in which they reside, right? And in order for a community schools director or coordinator to come up with that plan effectively and have deep community buy-in both within the school building as well as outside the school building, having a site-based or leadership team established that has a broad cross-section of the community is really, we think, integral to add back in. So my written testimony has some specific recommendations about a definition and where that could be included, specifically including it in section 3D 1 and A around grant uses and ensuring that the community schools coordinator works with the team that is defined in my testimony in the development and execution of these demonstration pilots. So that would be the one very specific recommendation. The second one is about sort of a needs and asset assessment. And this is also another one of those components of the community schools model that is critical to the sort of fidelity, as well as making sure that it actually is reflective of the needs of the community. So that would be something that could also go into the use of grant funding section 3D, and specifically 1, and making sure that there is a needs assessment done in order and before the sort of project, I don't want to say before the project begins, but as the project is beginning, as a deep part of the planning process as this is deployed into the school districts that are choosing to apply for this program. And I specifically mentioned in 1D because in D1, in D2, it talks about it if you're hiring a new coordinator, but in D1, it talks about if you're kind of repurposing an existing staff person. And we still think that the planning process, this sort of needs assessment process, is really critical to get it right. Because if you're talking about dealing with all these complex issues that we're talking about, having stakeholder buy-in and having that needs assessment as a basis is really critical, however the school district is stepping into this work. So those specific recommendations are outlined in my written testimony. The final thing I want to lift up, and this is something I believe Representative James spoke to in her testimony before your committee, is making sure there's an equity lens brought into this. Obviously, your committee's spoken about that in other ways and in spaces. And the community schools model nationwide has been really used as a way to make sure there are culturally relevant curriculum, that issues that are impacting our BIPOC community are effectively addressed. And also, I think you heard it in other testimony as well, perhaps from Representative James, about also overlaying that in the actual application review process to make sure it's not just the communities that have the resources to put together a really great grant application, not that they might not have great need for it, but making sure that it's also districts and schools that are interested in stepping into this exciting, innovative work are able to step into it as well. So for that, I would actually encourage you to hear from the folks at Voices for Vermont's Children. They spoke, they testified briefly in House Education on this, and they had some recommendations that I think would be good to for the committee to hear from. Finally, for a more global view, New Mexico just passed a law on community schools in 2019. And obviously, you know, New Mexico and Vermont are different, but there is rurality in common between the two. And there's a fellow, Dave Greenberg, out of New Mexico, who has been deeply involved in not only the passage of the law, but also the implementation of it. And I think it might be interesting for the committee to hear from him. He's aware of what we're doing here in Vermont as you continue to work through this. And as Lieutenant Governor, Secretary, former Senator Racine spoke to, the Learning Policy Institute is also another really, really great resource. So I know we're short on time. My specific recommendations are in my written testimony, but the top lines are we're very excited about this project to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all students so they can actually access their learning.
But you would agree that it's just meeting the needs of students in the pilot program?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, so not all of our students, but those
Correct.
that are into this pilot program. Questions for Mr. Robinson or others before we take a pause and then move on to Mr. Giles? Okay, committee, thank you all. Thank you to our witnesses. We'll continue on this topic and may have some of you back to answer additional questions, but I think it's a bill without a doubt that this committee is enthusiastic about, and just trying to find our way and see if maybe we might make a few suggestions before advancing it. Okay, committee, let's come back a little, take a 5-minute break. We've been at it for a while.